everybody. It's a pleasure to be back here after almost a year. I want to apologise to begin with. I don't have notes to give you this weekend. Please don't chastise me. I've already been chastised enough for it. And I don't really have any good excuses. So hopefully you can bear with me and you'll still be blessed. So, I don't know how many of you are aware, when I look around, most of the people I see here I've met before, and therefore I know that most of you are familiar with the basic tenets of this message, the things that we talk about. You'll all be aware that over the last 3 years, we began to understand some refinements to our message. And the thing that really began to open up 3 years ago were truths about midnight. And I'm sure you're all aware that in the midst of the discovery of those truths, that there was a shaking in this movement. Does anybody not know what I'm talking about when I say that? Yeah, so some people don't. So I presume you know what a shaking is. Yeah? A shaking, if you put something into a sieve and you shake it, you get a separation of two groups. And that's what happened about 3 years ago in connection with the truths about midnight that the Lord was revealing to us. This wasn't the first time that there was a shaking in this movement. I sometimes think people aren't aware of that. People have come and people have left. But about 3 years ago, it was the biggest shaking that we'd had in this movement. And since then, things haven't really improved much, unfortunately. But we shouldn't be surprised by that. You know, we're all familiar with the parable of the 10 virgins, but when it comes into real life, I think it still seems to take us by surprise. So in those 3 years, when we began to consolidate the truths about midnight, and it already began with the study of Ezra chapter 7, and I hope we're all familiar with those truths about what Ezra 7 did for this movement and how it opened the truths of midnight. Is that an affirmative, or maybe we're not? Maybe we're still. Some of us still perhaps aren't too sure. I presume we all know about midnight cry. The term midnight cry comes from the parable of the 10 virgins, which gives us the framework for this message. And if you read the passage, Matthew 25, it doesn't really distinguish between midnight and midnight cry. But if you go back into Millerite history and you trace the events over the 6 months or 7 months, depending on how you count them, of 1844, you begin to discover that midnight and midnight cry end up being two separate waymarks. And the discovery of that truth opened a lot of light for us. Things went happily along for the last 3 years until last year. Last year, through, I guess it must be providence, I don't know, an agitation began to occur in this movement once again. And the thing that agitates people in this movement is when you start moving things around. Now, we all know we're not supposed to move the waymarks. And whenever you get into any discussion about some new thoughts, some new ideas, someone is likely to accuse you of moving waymarks. So that's the controversy that we find ourselves in at this very moment in our movement. There are truths that people think that they're discovering, and in the discovering of those truths, people think waymarks are being moved. So if you listen to presentations or you watch videos about School of the Prophets back down in Arkansas, you'll know that that's what the focus is at the moment, in how not only to resolve the truth about Daniel 11, but how to address these issues of the moving of waymarks and the implications of all of those things. So I don't know if that's new to everybody here. I'm sure it's not for most of us, but it may be for a couple of us. So you'll see that the emphasis that Brother Tabo is presenting this weekend about the prediction before midnight, maybe you haven't appreciated what he's trying to show you. At one level, he would be accused of moving waymarks. I don't know if you can perceive that and see that's what he's doing. The things that we thought were going to happen in the future, we're now beginning to realise are a present-day experience before the events that we were thinking only a short while ago. So I don't know if everybody sees that in that context. Every time we find a new development of truth, what tends to happen is what we thought was going to be somewhere way down the line, we actually begin to realise is a lot closer to home. And when that happens, people get disturbed. And that disturbance causes a shaking. And that's what's happening right now. So let me put it this way. I was speaking to my sister earlier on, and this was her thoughts, not mine, but I'm in agreement with them. So a while ago, there was a discussion or a controversy about when the day of the Lord was. And the day of the Lord means a number of different things. It means a day of judgment and punishment, but it also means a day of restitution, a day of restoring things. Sometimes I don't think we fully appreciate that it has these two components or two parts to it. So if this was the day of the Lord, and this was the Sunday law, and this was 9/11, then we teach that the day of the Lord begins on Sunday. Right here, the Sunday law. And there are many reasons for that. But a really simple one would be that we're preparing for the Sunday law, and the preparation day is the 6th day, and Sunday is the 7th day, and there's a controversy during the Sunday law time period about Sabbath keeping and the mark of the beast, the mark of his authority, which is Sunday sacredness. And we know that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, where we take this phrase, the day of the Lord. So you can begin to develop an argument that we're now living in the 6th day, the day of the Lord's preparation, and this would be the 7th day. This is just basic understanding that we've had for a long while. And you can develop this thought further, because if you go back to Genesis and the creation of humanity, after the creation of human beings on the 6th day, they marry. So there is a marriage that's brought to view in the book of Genesis on the 6th day before the 7th day Sabbath rest. And we introduced that concept, the issue of marriage and the importance of marriage in this preparation time. And when we speak about marriage, we're not talking about it in its literal sense. We're talking about it in its symbolic sense. And marriage is the union of a man and a woman. And if you take those symbols of what a man represents and what a woman represents, you can begin to develop a model that shows you it's a relationship between a government and the church. And the Bible uses that relationship between a government and the church and uses the phrase, the image of the beast, or this union of two organizations which are not supposed to be together. Yeah? So we use the phrase image of the beast, and it's probably a phrase that might confuse people because an image just means a copy. And when we talk about the image of the beast, we need to understand what we're copying. And what we're actually copying is a system that was developed a couple of 100 years ago in the Dark Ages between the governments in Europe and the church in Europe, the papacy. So they, between themselves, developed a beast whose purpose was to persecute God's people. After the deadly wound in 1798, that beast died. And the death of that beast was not the death of the church and not the death of a government. It was the dissolution of a marriage. Sometimes I think we don't appreciate what that deadly wound was in 1798. It was really a divorce settlement between two parties. And both parties still are alive and well today. And that woman is looking for a new suitor. And she's already found the suitor, which I think perhaps we don't fully realize. So the marriage between this man and the woman, this government and this church, is in one level already taken place, but we all know that a marriage isn't just, a 2-minute thing. It goes over a whole day. You have many, many intricacies about the wedding. So this is the period of the wedding. So the controversy that occurred a few years ago was about where the day of the Lord is. Is it here at Sunday or is it here at 9/11? And that shaking produced a separation. Today, we're having similar arguments. If this is midnight cry and this is midnight, phrases both taken from Matthew 25, then where would we consider the day of the Lord being here? So it's a discussion about the day of the Lord, but as soon as we do that, unless you're familiar with the development of truths that have occurred over the last 3 years, you'll already be thrown here, because if I were to put it in this scale, this is what we're talking about here. Midnight and midnight cry. So already you can see that things have already moved. The day of the Lord has actually been moved forward already. And most people in this movement now are comfortable with that. But what the discussion is it here at midnight cry or here is it midnight? Now that's one way of discussing or understanding what the controversy is in this movement. There are many, many models that we could bring to view to try and explain, hopefully in a simple way, so that we can realize what the discussion is all about. So another way of discussing this issue is not thinking about the day of the Lord, but thinking about agriculture. So when we think about agriculture, we know that there are many parables, many Old Testament symbology stories that deal with agriculture. And perhaps the one that's caused the most problems for us in this movement as of date is Matthew 13. So let's have a look at Matthew 13 briefly. We're not going to make any conclusions on this. We just want to read the verses that are causing problems to us. The Matthew 13 is a chapter that's devoted really to parables. And there are a few parables in here. They all are essentially telling the same story, but they're looking at the problem in a different way. So we want to look from verse 24. Matthew 13, verse 24. Another parable put he forth unto them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man which sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat, and went his way. But when the blade was sprung up and brought forth fruit, then appeared the tares also. So the servants of the householder came and said unto him, Sir, didst not thou sow good seed in thy field? From whence then hath it tares? And he said unto them, An enemy hath done this. The servant said unto him, Wilt thou then that we go and gather them up? But he said, Nay, lest whilst ye gather up the tares, ye root up also the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And in the time of harvest I will say to the reapers, Gather ye together first the tares, and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. So there's a lot of information in this parable, even though it's only a few verses, and it seems relatively straightforward. And the controversy or the discussion that's going on at the moment is, let's go ahead and read verse 27 again. So the servants of the householder came and said unto him, Sir, didst not thou sow good seed in thy field? From whence that hath it tares? Verse 28, the householder says, An enemy did this. And in verse 28 as well, they ask, should they deal with the problem? And then in verse 29 he says, no, leave them until the harvest, verses 29 and 30. So the question is, who are the wheat and who are the tares? So I think that's a relatively straightforward question. I know everybody's really quiet, but I'm quite willing for us to have a bit of a dialogue here. There's very few of us, and you're all well behaved and won't cause trouble. So please go ahead. So, respond to me. What do we think the wheat and the tares are representative of?
Well, the wheat are God's people.
Good people, God's people. And the tares? The foolish. So they're both God's people. Yeah? So we want to start saying that maybe these are the wise and the foolish. Yeah? We could look at the same chapter and just go towards the end a bit, and we'll go to verse 47. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a net that was cast into the sea and gathered up of every kind. So it says every kind, and how many kinds are there? 2 kinds. And it's going to tell us that. Which when it was full, they drew to shore and sat down and gathered the good into vessels, but cast the bad away. We can see the 2 groups. So shall it be at the end of the world. The angel shall come forth and sever the wicked from among the just, and shall cast them into the furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. So we can see that it says good and bad, verse 48, and the wicked and the just. So you'd have the just and the wicked, and the good and the bad, and these are fish. So you can see that if we're going to use the methodology that we use often, line upon line, that you have the ability to take these symbols, which may appear independent of one another, and bring them all together to develop a story. Is that fair enough? Okay, so when we think about this story, some of them are easy to see and some of them aren't so easy to see. And what I'm referring to is what I'm going to say in a moment, not what we've already said. So I'm going to make a point, and some of the story you can easily see and some of them aren't so easy to see. Okay, so do we know any other 2 group stories? Because there are many of them. Any more? The 10 virgins. So I think we've got the wise and the foolish here, and this was the 10 virgins. Anyone else? Anything?
Just and unjust.
Sorry?
Just and unjust.
The just. What story would that be? The just and the unjust. I'll give you time to. Cain and Abel. Yeah. So if I did this, 11 and 1, what would that be? Judas and the disciples. Judas is here and the 12 disciples. So you can see that we have many, many stories. Did you? Okay, that's fine. There's more than the 6 that are here. We have a lot of stories that deal with these two groups. We'll look at one more. Jeremiah. Let's go to the book of Jeremiah. As we're turning there, just want to refresh our minds why we're looking at this. So there's a controversy over Matthew 13, particularly this parable of the wheat and the tares, and I'm going to explain what the issue is. But remember, the backdrop of all of this is, where do we place things? We have a habit in this movement of taking things that were in the future and making them into the present. And when we do that, it causes people a disturbance, causes people trouble. So the main controversy or argument that we have with the church structure, the main body of the church, is the fact that they put everything here at Sunday law, and they say that here is where you need to get ready for things that are about to happen. And we say that's not correct. You need to be ready way back here at 9/11. 9/11 is the marker to get ready for what's about to happen. Yeah? So this is where this discussion is headed, or this controversy in the movement today, is, are things going to happen here in this history, or are they going to happen before? So that's what the argument is. Where do you place events? Where do you get these stories, and where do you put them? So we're in Jeremiah chapter 15, and we'll look at verse 19. Therefore, thus saith the Lord. I didn't give you the chapter, that's why you're still looking, isn't it? It says book. Therefore, thus saith the Lord, if thou return, then I will bring thee again, and thou shalt stand before me. And if thou take forth the precious from the vial, thou shalt be as my mouth. Let them return unto thee, but return not thou unto me. So I'm not understanding or explaining where, what all of these verses mean, but I just want to show us that these two groups. So we can see two groups here, the precious and the vial. So we've got the precious and the vial. This was Jeremiah. And any more? People didn't take us to Daniel 12? Israel and Judah, the one tribe and the 11. If we can say that, it's actually 10 and 2. So in Daniel 10, what are the two groups there? Or in Daniel 12? Yeah? What verse would we be looking at? Yep. So we've got the wise. The wise shall understand. And then you've got the wicked. So we've got many testimonies of these two groups.
Should Abel be under the wise and Cain?
Good idea. I'm so used to saying Cain and Abel, I just put it down that way. So, as I say, not all of these stories identify what we're going to say what we're going to see now, but some of them do. So let's look at Jeremiah. So you've got the precious and the vial, and without you perhaps realising it, I've already got the third party. You've got a third group here, it's Jeremiah. Can we see that Jeremiah is outside of the precious and the vial? Yeah? Jeremiah is going to be doing the work to these precious and vial people, or for them. So here's the disciples. You've got the 11 disciples and the one disciple. And who's the third group here, the third person? Jesus. So I'll just symbolise Jesus here as a cross. And this one here, the good fish and the bad fish. And what's the third group? Fishermen. And can't remember what this one is. What's this one? The just and the wicked. So, 10 virgins. The story of the 10 virgins. Is there a third group there? Sorry? The one who cries. Because both sets of virgins are asleep. So none of the virgins are doing any crying. And the wheat and the tares. It's called the servants in the parable. Yeah, it says servants. So can we see that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we've got at least 5 stories that show us that there's this third group. And the way the stories are written, the third group are not part of these 2 groups. Can we see that? Is that relative? That's straightforward to see. So, if you have the wheat and the tares, these 2 groups, you begin to see, hopefully, that there's a problem. Let's go to Matthew 25. Verse 1. Matthew 25, verse 1. And the chapter begins with the word then. Now, I'm not the best at English, but from my understanding, when you use the word then, it can have 2 meanings. It can be used in 2 different ways. It can be used as a sequence. Something happened, then something happened afterwards. Yeah? So it gives a sequence. So you could think of present and future, or past and present. Yeah? So it's talking about a timing of things. Everybody okay with that? That's how we can use the word then. But then can also be used in a different way. It can be used in the term of at the same time. When something happened at the same time. So it can be used both ways. So what we're required to do is determine in Matthew 25 how that word is being used there. Is it being used as something's happened first, then something's going to happen afterwards, or is it saying at the same time? So I don't know what we think about that. I don't know if we've even thought about that. But can I say, I can assure you, that's not a very good way of studying. But I think the word then means at that time. So that's the premise that I'm basing upon. So you don't have enough time to think about it, obviously, because of the dynamics of what we have. So have a think about that later on. If you think the word then means at that time or in the future. And it's really important. I think it's really important. It then says the kingdom of heaven. So I understand the kingdom of heaven to be God's kingdom. And that can be represented in many different ways, in many different levels. And it says, then shall the kingdom of heaven be likened unto 10 virgins. And it tells you that the 10 virgins, 5 are wise and 5 are foolish. So I would contend that this is not a symbol of the kingdom of heaven, God's kingdom, his government, that's actually in heaven. Because there aren't any foolish people there. There aren't any wicked people. Cain isn't there. Because everyone in heaven, in fact the whole universe, are all on one side. There aren't 2 groups. The only place that you'll find 2 groups in God's kingdom is where? Here on earth. Yeah? So it's not a rigid proof, but I think there's enough information here to show you that this is talking about the kingdom of heaven on earth. Ellen White will comment about the parable of the 10 virgins. In many ways, the Millerites believed that it was talking about the church here on earth. So, and I think that's correct. So it says, at that time, the kingdom of heaven, the church on earth, is going to look like 10 virgins. And if it said at that time, because that's what I'm saying then means, you'd want to know when that time is. And I would suggest the way you find out when that time is you start working your way back, which would be Matthew 24. And Matthew 24 is going to give you the timing of when this church looks like 10 virgins. Is that reasonable? Yeah? Now, we could do this by just reading the Spirit of Prophecy quote, and it would all be done and dusted. But I want us to see that you can actually work it out straight from the Scriptures. Can't work out everything straight from the Bible. We have to be frank about that. There are many twists and turns that only you can really find explained properly and effectively in the Spirit of Prophecy. But I want us to see that when we're studying our Bibles, there's a lot of information there that sometimes we just gloss over, which would teach us many things. So let's go back to Matthew 24, because that's going to tell us the time period in which we are dealing with in this chapter of Matthew 25. Now, we're not going to read Matthew 24, all of it, only a couple of verses. Matthew 24 is probably the most important prophecy, I think, in the whole of Scripture, because it's given 3 times in a lot of details. It's given in Matthew 24, Mark chapter 13, and Luke chapter 21. And what's unique about this prophecy, in my opinion, is the way Christ structures it. So, I don't know if you know the background of this. This is AD 31 where it starts. Christ has just cleansed the temple for the second time. He's days away from being crucified, and he's left Jerusalem, and they're going up the Mount of Olives, and the disciples look back and they see how beautiful Jerusalem is. And he realizes what they're thinking, and he tells them that if I were you, I wouldn't be looking in that direction because that place is about to be destroyed. And then he explains this parable. And because they don't understand, they don't even believe anything that he's teaching because of the education that they've received, he codes a lot of his language and merges these prophecies into a singular narrative, which is Matthew 24. And we as God's people are supposed to understand how to break down and divide this chapter properly. And Ellen White does this very effectively in The Desire of Ages, chapter 69. So if we were to we're not going to turn there. If you go to chapter 69 of Desire of Ages, she'd break down, it's almost a verse-by-verse commentary on this chapter. Now, she gives us a lot of the clues, but you still have to do a lot of work by yourself. So you can see I've got Matthew 24 here, and I've divided it into 3 sections. And she'll give you the clues for that, but she may not state it explicitly. So these 3 sections are as follows. You've got the disciples, or what we might call the New Testament church. So it begins with the New Testament church, and then it jumps from around AD 100, where you have the last apostle, John, and it jumps 400 plus years into the future to the Dark Ages. So there's a big gap here where I've got a point. So this is the Dark Ages. So this is AD 31, and this is approximately 100, whatever number people are going to use for the book of Revelation, to 538. So they collapse to a singular point. So I don't know if we can see that or conceptualize it, that you can squash that to a singular point. And I'll repeat that again. Let me just see if I can find a passage to verify that. keep your fingers in Matthew 24 and go to Luke 21. So in Luke 21, and I'm going to repeat what I've just said here, but I'm going to use a Bible verse to demonstrate that. Luke 21:24. Luke 21:24 says, "And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." Now we're not going to go into detail what the times of the Gentiles is, but it talks about Jerusalem being destroyed. And we know that Jerusalem is destroyed in AD 70. So that's the destruction of Jerusalem, AD 70. But the way verse 24 is written, it shows you that Jerusalem is not only going to be destroyed there, but that destruction is continual. It's going to continually be destroyed until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And if we were to do a study on the times of the Gentiles, we would show that it doesn't end in AD 70. The times of the Gentiles do not end in AD 70. They go on much, much further for hundreds of years. So what Jesus does here is he takes you to the New Testament church, talks about the destruction of Jerusalem, and from the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, he's going to jump into the Dark Ages. Because the Dark Ages are nothing more than a continual, as it says here, treading down of Jerusalem, because it goes from literal Jerusalem, the city, to symbolic Jerusalem, God's people or his church. So Jesus seamlessly goes from one dispensation to another as a singular point, and he collapses them, the history between here, these 400 plus years, he collapses them into a singular point. 538. 538, the beginning of the Dark Ages. And then it goes to 1798. And then it's this one that causes us problems. It not only causes us problems, it causes many, many people problems. But it causes Adventist problems. So I'm going to call this one the time of the end. So we can pick up that phrase, time of the end, from Daniel 11 and Daniel 12. The primary one we normally go to is Daniel 11 verse 40, the time of the end. At the time of the end, there's going to be a struggle between the king of the north and the king of the south. But when Ellen White uses the phrase time of the end, she uses it in two ways. She uses it as a singular point, a specific date, 1798. So this would be at the time of the end, and I'll put at the time of the end, something's going to happen. But she also uses the time of the end in another way, and it's spanning this history here, and we'll call that in. So you have at the time of the end and in the time of the end. And if you don't see that distinction and the way it's used in both contexts, sometimes you can come to a misunderstanding of some of the statements that Ellen White uses. So we're back in Matthew 24, and Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21 are all divided into these three segments. So when it talks about Matthew 24, we're in this history here. Now it takes some explaining, and we're not going to be doing that, but when it says, "Then shall the kingdom of heaven," I'm suggesting when it says "then" at that time, what you've got to do, you've got to go back into this chapter and say, when is that referring to? The then, is it referring to this date, or this date? Because this spans 2,000 years. When are we going to pick up the then? And I'm going to suggest that it's here. This is when the then is. If we were to read verse 34, Matthew 24:34, it says, "Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled." And this verse has caused people many problems in the past when it says all these things. Because you have to ask yourself, when is all these things? Is it the whole of the chapter, or is it only part of the chapter? And you can demonstrate that it's only part of the chapter. All of these things is actually this last section. So I'm going to put all here. And this is verse 34. All of the things is in verse 34 is talking about this third section of the prophecy. And this third section of the prophecy begins in verse 29. So let's read verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, so this is the tribulation here, the Dark Ages, that's what it's referring to. The sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. So that's verse 29. It talks about 3 signs that are given to you in verse 29. What are the 3 signs? Sorry? Yep, you have the moon, and you have the sun, and you have the stars. And if we were to go to Revelation chapter 1, I think, what else would we see? Was another sign. Not verse 1, obviously. It's, let me check. Revelation 6. This is an earthquake. So we have 4 signs that are given to us that begin to mark that the days of tribulation have come to an end. Is everybody familiar with that? Yes? Yeah, this is all stand. So, do we know the dates for these? (1833). Sorry, the earthquake is? So we'll do this one. Some says 1780, yeah? And the earthquake? So the earthquake is 1755. So we've got our dates here. But we've got 1798. And so you can see, if I were to put them on this chart, you'd have one here, and one here. And it says those 4 events are going to mark that the tribulation has ended. Is that how you read verse 29? Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heaven shall be shaken. We didn't read Revelation, let me put the verse down, Revelation 6 verse 12. But Revelation 6 verse 12 gives you this earthquake, the Lisbon earthquake.
Oh, I'm sorry. You said verse 29. Which chapter is that?
Matthew 24. We're all in Matthew 24. Are we okay with that? So I don't know if everybody's familiar with these, but I think what we haven't appreciated as Adventists is how we actually grapple and deal with these 1, 2, 3 dates. It's 3 dates because these happen on the same day. So you have these 3 dates here. How we grapple with those, because none of them are 1798. And I think as Adventists we've sort of glossed over those things and sort of just say that they're harbingers of what's about to happen. But the problem is, the stars in 1833, this is 35 years after the event has already happened. So we don't really have a good explanation of what to do with those symbols. when I say we, Adventists don't, but we have a reasonably good answer to explain what these are all referring to. Hopefully, I think we know that. So these things will show us a structure about our own message. Should we do that? Shall we quickly do that? Let's see how that works. So this one's a bit, you need to have some background information. This is not that straightforward. But if we go back to the story of Christ, so this is a little line of Christ, and here he's going to be crucified. So this is the crucifixion of Christ. And he's crucified at what hour? Do we know? The 6th hour. So this is the 6th hour to the 9th hour. 12 o'clock to 3 p.m. And at the 6th hour, what happens? So you've got darkness here. And at the 9th hour, there's an earthquake. Does everybody know this? It's this earthquake that opens up the graves of those dead men who are going to be resurrected the same time as Jesus is. So we're all familiar with this story, yes? We can demonstrate, so I'm not going to prove this, that the 6th and the 9th hour can be symbolized by midnight and the midnight cry. And one of the arguments for that, if I can just do it in a simple way, is taking a totally different story. This is not the story of Christ now, but this is the story of the farmer who goes out and hires labourers. It talks about the 11th hour workers. You all familiar with that story? And in that story, you have all the same hours. You have some more at the beginning, but it talks about the 11th hour workers. And Ellen White comments on the 11th hour workers in two different ways. She talks about 11th hour workers in the general sense, but in a specific prophetic sense, she identifies the 11th hour workers as the Gentiles. Does everybody know that? Everybody familiar with that? That they're called the 11th hour workers who are going to come in at the last moment of the great controversy. And we know that they're going to come in at the Sunday law. So we have here the Sunday law, and we already knew that we had a line of truth that went from 9/11, midnight cry, Sunday law, and all we're doing is superimposing another story on top of this. The story we're superimposing on top of this is the story of this farmer who's going to hire labourers. So once we can locate the 11th hour, we just work backwards and got the 6th and the 9th, and then we notice that the 6th and the 9th, that this is the story of Christ, and so we've got the darkness and the earthquake. Does that make sense? Yeah? That's compressing many, many hours of research and study and probably about 2 hours of presentation, really. But I think most of us are familiar with it. And if you're not, hopefully that you're familiar enough with the message that you can see the veracity of that argument. Perhaps.
But the farmer who hires all these people,
Yes.
he starts at the morning and then noon.
So it's at the morning here, then at the 3rd, the 6th, the 9th, and the 11th. You can track it right through our movement, our line. But it's only these ones that we're focusing on at the moment. So you can see that the dark day and the earthquake are already lining up with these, because here's the dark day. So you've got darkness and you've got the earthquake. Can we see that we can begin to get these and see that they're typifying this story here? Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So let me develop this over here. if this was 1798, which is that, and there's those three dots, 1, 2, 3, 55, 80, and 33, yes? We know that 1798 is actually 1989. So let's put 1989 here. And then we have 9/11. And then you have midnight and midnight cry. It's the same thing that I've just got over here. So let's deal with one of the easier ones, the ones that we're probably all familiar with, the stars that fall in 1833. Yeah? Where do we place that on our line? 1833. What does 1833 represent to us? Sorry? Is that what you said? Yeah? So this is the formalization of the message. Brother Tabo, if we turn the board around, I think it's actually on the board on the other side. He did that yesterday. So this is formalization of the message, 1833. And 1833, in our history, is the publication of the Time of the End magazine, 1996. Okay? So here, 1996, you've got the formalization of the message, which are these stars that have fallen here. So what it's teaching you in Matthew 24 verse 29, it's showing you what's about to happen as you trek through that history. And one of the markers that it's going to give you is the stars falling in 1833. And what we haven't understood as Adventists is what that is supposed to be showing us. And it's supposed to be showing us that there's going to be a formalization of the message. So we can pick that up. Now, if I take these two here, this is the dark day, and this is the earthquake here. And we got that from the 6th, and we got that from the 9th. This was at the cross. But if we go back to this story here, we can see that you have the dark day and the earthquake, 1755 and 1780. Now, what I want to suggest is that we're going to use these symbols here, these two red dots, and we're going to apply them prophetically. So when you begin to apply them prophetically, what you can show is that the first one here is this earthquake, and the second one here is the dark day. So when you take this history and you begin to apply it on this line here, what they're actually showing you, literally, there were these dates here, and that's all good and well, but prophetically, they're showing you that there's a track of events that are occurring that are going to bring you all the way down to the close of probation. And you can do that whether you're talking about Millerite history or whether you're coming on this line to the end of the world, the second advent. And we're going to show that in the verses that come to view now. So in Millerite history, this would have been 1798, 1833, and 1840. So what I've done is I've taken these things and I've symbolized them and put them on a line to show you that things are going to happen as you get to October 22nd, 1844. They're showing you that this event is about to happen. That's what those signs are doing for you. Now, they're doing it in a literal way, because you see them literally in the heaven, but you can apply them prophetically as well. And the prophetic application is these. What I haven't shown you is that you can take these events here and you can see that they parallel the events here. So 1989 to 9/11 and midnight to midnight cry. So the history that's happening in this portion of our own history is very similar, or a type, of this history that's going on here. One way to express or to show that is the following. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall was taken down, I think most of us know that it was actually, what day did it actually happen? Does anybody know what day it happened? What day was the Berlin Wall taken down? It was November the 9th. Yeah? So November the 9th is the 9th day of the 11th month. It's 9/11. It's a symbol of 9/11. And the time of day that it occurred was at midnight. So you can show that 1989 is a type of midnight. And you can also show, which we're not going to do now, that 9/11 has characteristics about midnight cry. So all I'm just showing you is that there's a relationship between this history here and the history that's going to occur in this area here, or this time period, which I'm going to call the binding off. We've all heard of the term binding off, I think. We'll read a Spirit of Prophecy quote to define that a bit better in a bit. So once you can establish that this history is this history, which is prefiguring it, you begin to see that this truth about this clustering of events is actually teaching us that this end is about to happen. So, just moving down to verse 30, Matthew 24, verse 30. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So, again, this is a passage that we should be reasonably familiar with, I think, where we see Jesus coming in the clouds of heaven. So we're going to pick up clouds. When does Jesus come in the clouds of heaven? We can go to Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. Passage we should be familiar with, I think. Behold, he cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see him, and they also which pierced him, and all kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him. Even so, Amen. When is that? That's the second advent. It's not a trick question, so that's the second advent. So when we see the clouds, it's dealing with the second advent. So when you go from Matthew 29 to 24 verse 29, 24 verse 30, you can see that it's taken you all through this history here, from 1798 all the way to the second advent. And we call this the time of the end. But we also see Jesus coming on the clouds of heaven in a different passage. This is Daniel chapter 7. So let's turn to Daniel chapter 7, and we're going to see the same thing, that Jesus is coming in clouds there. So we'll read the verse first and then make application. It's verse 13. Daniel 7, verse 13. I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. So, when is that? When does Jesus come to the Ancient of Days? We are okay with that? So, the clouds have two applications. It's the second advent, I'll put it up here, but it's also 1844. So as soon as you see that, now you can begin to develop the arguments that we have in our movement in a really simple fashion to show a number of things. That Matthew 24 has two applications. It has an application to Millerite history, because this is 1798 to 1844. That's one application. And then the second application that it has is 1798 to the Second Advent. Can we see that? That should be relatively straightforward. Then, let's go back to Matthew 24. And I'm sure by now you'll have forgotten why we're even here. And sometimes when I'm doing this, I think, why are we even looking at this for? And I know why. We're looking at the third group. That's what we're looking for, remember? We're trying to discuss this issue of the third group. So in Matthew 24, we're in verse 31. So when they see Jesus coming in the clouds of heaven, it says, "And he shall send his angels with the great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect, from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." So that's verse 31. So in this application here, the Second Advent, who are these angels? In the application of the Second Advent. I didn't hear what you said, sorry. In the Second Advent application? I think it's unfallen angels who come back from heaven with Jesus, and when they sound the trumpet, the dead in Christ shall rise. So these are literal angels who are going to come here. But in this application of 1844, then who are those angels? So those angels now cannot be literal angels, because we have no record of literal angels doing anything on the scale that's being portrayed in verse 31. From one end of the earth to another, they're not doing this kind of work. So you can see that there are two applications now, and we're looking at this application here, 1798 to 1844. So these angels now that are being discussed are who? So these are symbolic. At least we can understand, we agree it's symbolic. So I'm saying these are people. Are we all okay with that? That in this application, that the angel of people. Yeah? So you can see that there's this group of people who are going to be doing a work, and who are they calling? The elect. Yeah? And who are the elect? The wise. So can we see that you've got, in this history, you've got the wise. We already know that you've got the wise and the foolish. We picked it up from Matthew 25. It says, at that time, which is this time here, at this time here, the church is going to look like 10 virgins, 5 wise and 5 foolish. And then if you go back to Matthew 24, it says, in that time period, you're going to have some angels who are going to do what? They're going to gather the elect together. And so when you put the elect together with Matthew 25, the elect are the wise. But you've got angels who are going to be doing something to the wise. So here we had the wise and the foolish, and we had a cry made at midnight. But we also now have another symbol for that story. It's not the cry at midnight, this third group, but it's who? We just did it in Matthew 24, verse 31. It's the angels. So before we move on, in fact, we'll conclude here and have a 10-minute break. What I've shown you in summary so far is there's a controversy in this movement. And the controversy is about where we place things. And part of that controversy is going to be explained by Matthew 13, verse 24, the wheat and the tares. We started looking at wheat and the tares, then we developed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's even more than 8 stories. We get these 8 stories where you see these two classes of people. But then you can see in each of those stories, we didn't pick every single one of them up because some aren't so easy to see. It doesn't even explain it in some stories. But we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stories where you've got this third group of people. And I gave you, we went now into Matthew 24, Matthew 25 to show that this third group of people are being identified in Matthew 24 as what? As angels. And the purpose of these angels is to do what? To gather the elect. And who are the elect? The wise. Okay? Now, if we're going to be true to ourselves, and to our methodology, you have to line all of these up into, we've got 3 columns, and in this column here, is everybody the same person? When we collapse them into a singular. If I just had if I got this and put it into 3 columns like this, 1, 2, 3. Now, if you go through rows, each row is different. It's a different row, yes? We okay? That's a different row. But if we go down to columns, is the column the same? So this column here is, if you had to put a title on here, that title should cover every single characteristic or every single story that's on a row. Does that make sense? So even though we're doing this, if you put a title to the column, the title should cover all the dynamics that's in that column. So what I'm saying about that is in this one here, because that's what we're talking about at the moment, who's in this column? So let's list them out. You've got servants, then you've got someone who cries, then you've got angels, then you've got fishermen, then you've got Jeremiah, and then who have you got? Then you've got Jesus. But what have we just said? All of these are what? They're all the same thing. Because you'd have to put a title on here, and we'll just call them the third group, for want of a better term. So what I want us to see is if we use line upon line methodology, these individual stories are just parables. They're parables of what? Yes, they're parables of our own story, of our history. So what we want to do is we want to try and discover who all of those people are. Who do they equal in our history? And we'd have to do the same with each one of those, obviously. So as we think about this, I want us to think about, what would this look like? Who would it be? What would it be? Would it be something that's literal, something that's not real, something that's you read about somewhere else, something that you can see? And as we go through these stories, what's common about all of these? They're all people. If you go to every one of those stories, they're all people, every single one of them. Perhaps the hardest one to see is the angels. But you know that if you go back into Millerite history, there's no record of literal angels flying around Earth. So they have to be, even if you don't understand that, you have to recognize that they're talking about some kind of symbolic angels that are being discussed here. So what I want us to see is that this third group are people. And these are also people, and so are these. So this takes you back to the age-old problem is in Matthew 25, if all the virgins are asleep, who makes the cry? I don't know if you ever asked yourself that question, but Adventists always talk about that. Who makes the cry at midnight in Matthew 25? And if you can answer that question, you can identify who that is. who this person is, because it's people. It has to be people. Hopefully we can see that. Yeah? And what we need to see is that in each one of these stories, these are parables. So when we come to this one here, the 11 disciples, Judas, and Christ, you can see that this story is identifying that you have these three groups, and what's common about this third group. So in this story here, what is this third group able to do? The wheat and the tares and the servants, what are they able to do? They've got some discernment. Yeah? So we've got discernment here. This one here, the wise, the foolish, and the cry. What's this cry? What do they have? They have a message. What is the message? So they have discernment as well. So they can discern that the bridegroom's about to come. Whereas these can't do that because they're sleeping, we know that. And then there's these angels who have got this mission. The fishermen. What do the fishermen do? They have discernment because they collect everybody together to begin with, then they take them to shore and they do what? They separate them. And this one here, what does Jesus have? He knows who is who. He knows one of them's a devil. He never selected Judas. So he has discernment. And Jeremiah, it says straight at the verse 15-19, it says, you're going to separate the precious from the vile. Very similar characteristics to what the angels do. They select the elect from the four corners of the earth. So you can see that this group of people, the thing that characterizes them is that they have discernment. Yes?
Could you say that Agabus was a kind of type of those with the discernment since he made that prediction?
You certainly can. Yes. Let me ask you another question. So the question is good or bad? Is Jeremiah good? So we'll put G for him. Is Jesus good? I've answered that one, that's easy. These fishermen, are they good? Because Jesus is going to make you fishers of men. Yeah? So these are good people. We know angels are certainly good. And this person who cries, he's helping these virgins, because if he hadn't made her cry, they'd all be asleep and none of them would have gone to the marriage. So they're good. Now, when you do line upon line methodology, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 good symbols, and you come to this one and you're not sure because you don't know the story well enough. What must they be, even if you don't understand the story? Yeah? So they must be good. I'll put this one in black. And the reason why I'm putting this in black and circling it is because in our movement there's a discussion about the motivation and the hearts of the servants in Matthew 13. Because people will look at a parable in isolation, and when you do that and you don't understand all the dynamics of a parable or a verse, it's easy to make a misapplication. It's easy to make a mistake. We know that, yeah? If you took one verse, you can make a mistake. But if you take stories and build them one on top of the other, all the thinking is done for you. You don't have to think. I mean, we didn't think about any of that. I don't even have to go into the story here. If I can show you that there's three groups, and I think we all agreed that there's three groups, and we know that these two groups here, the wheat and the tares, are symbolized in all these different stories, and these different stories have these three groups, and each one of them are easy to see that they're good. You know that the servants have to be good. Now, that might seem obvious, but I suggest the reason it's obvious is because of the way we approach the problem. Now, we could approach the problem in a totally different way, and I could have shown you that this group is bad, and you would have said, oh yeah, they're probably bad. And so it depends upon your methodology to understand if someone's good or if someone's bad. And if you stick to line upon line, I think you can demonstrate that this group of people are good. Now you might have thought, that took a long time to explain that. But it's important. It's important because this is one of the arguments, strong arguments, that people are using to explain Matthew 13. I say some people, all of us, are using an understanding of who the servants are to explain Matthew 13. And if you think the servants are good, or you think the servants are bad, it's going to change the outcome of your studies on where you're going to take this, the conclusion of all of this. So maybe some of us haven't thought about this before, but I'm sure there are people here in the room, certainly people who are watching the videos when they get posted up, that they know that there are two discussions about who the servants are, whether they're good or whether they're bad people. And if they're good, it changes the way you have to conceptualize and approach Matthew 13, the parable of the wheat and tares. If they're bad, again, you come to a different conclusion. So if you've heard this argument before and you've wondered how to decipher between the good and the bad because the arguments are strong on both sides, hopefully this little study has settled in your mind that these servants can't be bad people. They have to be good. But the implications of this extend beyond that. And as we go through our studies, hopefully we're going to see some of the implications of that. So let's close with prayer, and then we'll have a short break. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness and your mercy. Lord, we ask and pray that we might understand your word in a clear fashion, so not only does it ring true to us, but that it's simple for us to be able to explain and defend to those who would ask us the reason for our faith. Please help each of my brothers and sisters not to sit passively and accept the conclusions and the ideas that are presented here, but may each of us reason from cause to effect. May we spend time during this holy convocation not to frittle away the hours outside of study time, but to review the things that are being discussed, to ask questions, so that we might leave this place better informed and stronger in our convictions and our faith than when we first arrived. We pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.